In the spring of 1934, people across the high plains of Nebraska watched a young boy do something nobody could quite understand. He wasn't repairing fences, he wasn't planting crops, he wasn't hauling water or mending the roof the way most farm boys his age were expected to. Instead, he was planting rows of pine trees around his barn, row after careful row, seedling by seedling, evenly spaced, deliberately placed. His neighbors stopped at the edge of the road and watched with tilted heads. His grandmother watched from the kitchen window and said nothing. By summer, people were laughing at the trees. By winter, many would wish they had planted their own. If stories about hard work, wisdom, and rural life mean something to you, subscribe and join our farming family. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to know which part of the world you're calling home. His name was Eli Calloway. He was 12 years old. He had come to live on the farm the previous autumn after his father passed away from a fever that moved faster than the doctor could follow. His mother had no land of her own, and so Eli was sent to live with his grandparents, Harold and Ruth Calloway, on a modest stretch of working farmland outside a small Nebraska town called Grover Falls. Harold was a quiet man who walked with a limp. Ruth kept the books and the garden and never wasted a word. They were not unkind people, they were simply tired people, tired in the deep, bone-settled way that comes from decades of uncertain weather and uncertain harvests. Eli did not complain about his new life. He learned quickly and worked hard. He was the kind of boy who watched more than he spoke, who noticed things, the way the grass leaned in the morning before a change in weather, the way the chickens grew restless before rain. He had one companion who never left his side, a rust-colored farm dog named Soot, named for the dark smudge across his left ear. Soot followed Eli to the barn at dawn and back to the porch at dusk every single day without being asked. That spring, when Eli began hauling pine seedlings from the edge of the creek and planting them in measured rows around the barn, Soot supervised from a comfortable patch of grass and watched the boy work. Word traveled the way word always travels in small farming communities. Slowly at first, then all at once. By late April, it seemed like every neighbor within 5 miles had an opinion about what Eli was doing. The first to say something directly was Dale Mercer, who farmed the property to the east. Dale was a respected man, 60 years old, with calloused hands and a straightforward mind. He had seen 3 decades of plains weather. He knew what worked and what didn't. He pulled his wagon up to the fence one afternoon and leaned on the post. "Son," he said, "you know those trees won't give you much shade for 10 years or better." Eli nodded. "Yes, sir. And they won't give you timber for another 20. "Yes, sir." Dale waited for more. Eli offered nothing else. He just kept digging. The second voice came from Vaughn Oates, a practical builder from town who repaired barns and outhouses and knew the cost of every board foot of lumber on the plains. He stopped by one Saturday while passing through. "Boys planting a forest around a barn," he told people at the feed store that evening, not cruelly, but in the tone of a man reporting something genuinely puzzling. Seems like a lot of effort for decoration. That word stuck. Decoration. People repeated it, and it carried the particular weight of a word that sounds reasonable. Reasonable enough to stop a person from asking the next question. Nobody asked the next question. Nobody except Eli, and he already knew the answer. The answer had come from his grandfather Harold. That first autumn on the farm, Eli had gone looking for Harold and found him in the old storage shed, sitting on an overturned crate with a worn book across his knees. A decades-old agricultural manual, its spine cracked, its margins full of penciled notes. "Come here," Harold said, not an invitation, a fact. He showed Eli the pages about windbreaks and shelterbelts. Rows of trees planted on the north and west sides of farm buildings to slow wind before it reached crops, animals, and structures. The practice had been used by settlers for generations, documented in farming journals as far back as the 1870s. Not a new idea, an old one forgotten by people who believed newer was always wiser. Harold pointed to a line in the margin. "Wind spends its strength on the trees before it reaches the barn." He closed the book and handed it to Eli without another word. Eli read the entire book before winter. By spring, he knew exactly what he was going to do. The trees did not cooperate immediately. A dry August left the seedlings struggling. Eli hauled water from the creek bucket by bucket for 17 straight days. A September windstorm knocked over 12 stakes and snapped 3 young trees at the base. He restaked what survived and replaced the broken ones with spares kept in damp burlap near the barn. Then a dairy cow broke free one foggy morning and wandered through the rows, stepping on 2 seedlings and chewing the top from a third. Eli found her there, placid and unapologetic. He fixed the fence, replanted what could be saved, and said nothing. When Dale Mercer heard about the setbacks and offered a gentle "told you so," Eli simply nodded and went back to work. That was the year people learned that Eli Calloway was not easily discouraged. October arrived with teeth. The first light snow came nearly 3 weeks early. The animals on several farms grew edgy. Horses refused to settle. Dogs paced the porches after dark. The barn cats disappeared into the hay for days at a time. Harold watched the sky from the porch every morning and said less and less. An old man named Ezra Voss, who had lived in Grover Falls for nearly 70 years, and who had seen things on the plains that no one fully believed, walked out to the Calloway farm on a Tuesday in mid-October. He had heard about the trees. He had not come to laugh. He stood at the edge of the planted rows for a long time, looking at the young pines. Still young, still years from being truly useful, but alive and in their places. "This is a serious winter coming," he said to Eli. Eli looked up. "How do you know?" the boy asked. "The same way I know everything," Ezra said. "I've been watching this sky since before your father was born." He looked at the pines again. "These trees won't be full grown," he said quietly, "but they'll be something." He left without explaining what he meant. Eli turned back to the rows and checked the stakes one more time. It came on a Thursday in January, not slowly, not politely, but all at once, as though the sky had been waiting for months. The wind hit so hard the barn doors shook on their hinges. The temperature fell fast enough that water left outside turned to ice before it could be carried indoors. Within 3 hours, visibility had dropped to nothing. Farmers tied themselves to ropes just to check their animals. Dale Mercer's livestock huddled in the corner of his barn while wind drove through a gap in the wall. Several animals were in distress by morning. Von Oates spent half the night fighting drifts packed so high against his barn door he could barely force it open. On 3 farms to the west, roofing was torn loose, and at the Calloway farm, something different was happening. The wind reached the pine trees and slowed. This is what a windbreak does. When wind encounters a row of trees, it does not stop. It is diverted upward, its speed reduced by as much as half on the sheltered side. The protected zone extends downwind for a distance 10 to 15 times the height of the trees. Even young trees provide measurable reduction. The barn sat in a pocket of calmer air. The temperature difference was perhaps 4 to 6 degrees, but on a night when every degree mattered, it was real. Snow drifted into the outer tree rows and stopped rather than piling against the barn walls. The livestock moved around. They ate. The worst of the storm simply was not reaching them. Harold fed the animals at midnight and again at 4:00 in the morning. Eli carried the lantern. The hay stayed dry. The feed bins were untouched. By morning, the storm had passed. Dale Mercer came over on the second day after the storm. He had spent 2 days digging out and tending to animals that had been stressed by the cold. He walked to the Calloway farm, out of neighborly habit more than curiosity. He expected to find the same damage he was recovering from himself. He stopped at the edge of the property. The pine rows were bent, some of them, and snow had piled deep along their outer edges. But the barn stood exactly as it had stood before the storm. The drifts against the barn walls were modest. The doors opened cleanly. He went inside. The animals were calm. The feed was intact. The water in the trough had needed breaking only once. Eli was there cleaning out the stalls. Dale stood in the doorway for a long moment. "How much of the hay did you lose?" he finally asked. "None," Eli said. Dale looked around. He looked at the walls. He looked at the floor. He stepped back outside and looked at the tree rows. He was quiet for a long time. "I was wrong," he said. No speech, no ceremony, just a man who had built his life on honesty and could not avoid it now. Eli nodded once. "It was my grandfather's idea," he said. "I just planted the trees." That spring, Dale Mercer planted a windbreak on the north and west sides of his barn. By summer, 2 more farms had begun their own tree rows. Vaughn Oates spent a Saturday helping a young family plant theirs and did not charge them for his time. No announcement, no meeting. The idea spread the way practical wisdom always spreads on working land, person to person, season to season, quietly. Eli never told anyone he had been right. He went on watching, working, and tending to the things under his care. Old as Revos stopped by once more that spring, looking at the rows of young pines, green and growing. "Nature has a way of rewarding patience," the old man said, more to himself than anyone. "The things people mock today may become the wisdom everyone follows tomorrow." Suk sat beside Eli. Harold leaned on the fence post and said nothing. He had already said everything that mattered years ago in a quiet shed, pointing to a line in an old book's margin. "Wind spends its strength on the trees before it reaches the barn." As Will Rogers once said, the farmer has to be an optimist or he wouldn't still be a farmer. Eli Calloway was 12 years old when he planted those first seedlings. He was 81 when the last of the original pines finally fell, and by then, every farm in that county had a windbreak of its own. Have you ever been laughed at for doing something differently? Maybe you took a slower road, planted something that took years to matter, or held on to an idea that others couldn't see the point of yet. Tell us your story in the comments. And if you enjoyed today's lesson from the farm, the kind of lesson that only takes root with patience, don't forget to subscribe for more true-to-life rural stories. We'll be here, same as always, watching the sky and telling the stories that the land remembers.